Got an interesting one here this afternoon. I'm Brian Miles, Chief Technology Officer at Corian, and I'll try to stay in front of the mic and not wander too much. This is Jason Muchler. He's a solutions consultant in our emerging technologies group, working with our customers out in the field, but recently has moved to the dark side. So he's now in the product management group, bringing some of his expertise from the field back into the products that we have in the identity and intelligence space. So we've got three parts to the workshop this afternoon. I know folks are floating in and out. The first one is about the fundamentals of identity intelligence. We're going to talk about sort of what the traditional identity and access management solutions are doing today, what they're missing, and what some of the things are that we need rolling forward. And then in the second hour, Jason is going to take a deep dive in a couple of data breaches to talk about, what happened, how the bad guys got in, how they got the data out, and some things that might have been available and could have been used to help deter those guys. And then the third session, Jason is going to do a live risk assessment of data to help uncover things that might exist in your environment that you can't see today that you could remediate to combat what the bad guys are doing out there. So those are the three sessions this afternoon. So one of the premises that we have for this workshop in the overview is that identity and access management, while providing value for our businesses today, is necessary but not sufficient. So the things that we're doing today, they're providing value, they're helping us get our workers onboarded quickly, managing access, doing attestations if we need to do that, but yet we're still seeing a boatload of data breaches out there in the market. So what's missing, right? Why are these products not working? Or at least not working as far as it goes with the hacker. So we'll have some interactive parts to this session. 8.4 million. Anyone want to take a guess as to what that number represents? That's the number of residents in New York City. So all these numbers are going to relate to New York that we're going to see up here next. And this was from July of last year. 7.3 million? Anyone want to guess? Does anyone see the article for this? This is the number of New York City residents who were involved in some kind of data breach in 2013. So that's 86% of the New York City residents had a breach, had their data lost in some fashion. 900, that's the number of breaches that comprise the 7.3 million individuals. So it's about 8,000 records per breach on average. Some were bigger than others, obviously. And 1.3 billion, that is the dollar damage to both the public and private sector for the residents of New York. And that's, just one city in the US, and this is going on all over the world. Sure, how many folks have gotten something like this? How many folks in the room have their data breached or compromised? I've had at least 2 this past year. So are we matching the 85%? Not quite. But this is happening all the time, and this is a bit of a parody on a shopping cart of what you could buy as far as stolen data. But this is real. I mean, there are forums and sites out there that are selling credit cards, personal information, passwords, right? And they're stealing everything from anybody, right? All the retail organizations, governments, nation states. Anything with value, even if that value or that stolen data only has value for a short period of time. If folks can monetize it for a week, it's something that they're going to want to steal. The map in the lower right there, that is the Red October malware that was off attacking government organizations, right? So that was spread all over the world. We've heard about the RSA breach, the Target breach, and these things are popping up, every quarter, every year. We just see more and more. So what's interesting, and what we're talking about here is intelligence and analytics, and that's really about how can we take a look at the data that we have at hand, visualize it, look at it in new and interesting ways, rotate it, slice and dice it, and see things maybe that we couldn't see before. This is not related to identity and access, but really just related to the data breaches, but it's kind of interesting. So this is an interactive, there we go. Report and visual that talks about various kinds of data breaches. You can look at this from different dimensions, right? How was the attack done? What kind of business did it go after? What kind of data was compromised? And the IP or the URL is up there, but it's information is beautiful. But what's interesting here is that insider attacks, lost data, lost backups, lost laptops, those kinds of things was a pretty small piece of what was the cause or the vector that the breach happened in. But it's the hackers, right? Those are the folks that are making up most of the breaches that are out there. So you can see when we went through the video here, the animation, right? Lost computer, pretty small. Insider, pretty small. Hackers, gigantic, right? So these are the guys that are motivated. These are the guys going after things of value, or whether that's monetary value, political value, or otherwise. And they don't have to play within the confines of the law, right? So they're at an advantage. Here's another interesting visual. This is from Norse, and they threw up a honeypot onto the internet, I think about a month or two ago. Did anyone ever take a look at this? Yeah, this was really interesting. When they first put this honeypot up, what they're showing is live attacks going back and forth from source to destination, different kinds of malware that's floating around. And when they put this honeypot up, I mean, it lit up like a Christmas tree. It was unbelievable. It's much slower now. I guess bad guys have figured out that this is something that's something they don't want to be dealing with. But this is what the animation did. Is it showing you, and this is sort of a real-time visualization of what's going on from a malware perspective. And you can see, again, you can look at the attacks from different kinds of dimensions. What are they going after? Where is it coming from? What kind of attack is it? And it was pretty interesting to see when it first came out. I mean, there was probably 10 times the amount of traffic that we saw here going on when this honeypot was first stood up. So why aren't things working? FireEye talked about, if you seen this description, talks about the Maginot Line. This was in World War II, between the border of France and Germany. France learned from some of their experience in World War I. They said, Germany's likely to attack us, so they went and they built state-of-the-art defenses along the border with Germany. Concrete bunkers, weaponry, all kinds of things, and built an extremely strong perimeter defense or moat around that border. And all that happened was, Germany went in through Belgium. So the world that we're kind of working in today of trying to get that hard outer shell around our organization with the data that's floating all over the place, mobile devices, everything that we're dealing with, this kind of approach isn't really going to work anymore for us. And you start to see out there with different vendors in our space quotes like this, right? Symantec's starting to say, well, antivirus is not the future. So heard some rumblings of Google about, well, the VPN doesn't really help us that much. We can get just as much protection by having a publicly facing website with, stronger authentication, stronger authorization, more back-end controls, more checks going on. And if you've used Internet Explorer, since the life of Internet Explorer, you've been vulnerable. We've been vulnerable. Every version of IE has had issues, and some versions just vulnerable to drive-by types of surfing. So why are we losing? We're from Boston. I'm not really a New York hater, so for equal fairness, there's Tom Brady suffering, and I'm from Cleveland. So I'm a long-suffering football guy. There's no pictures yet of Johnny Football sitting on the bench, but yeah, game 2 we might have one. I think that's Peyton Hillis. So why are we losing? There's really 2 things that we believe are going on here that are causing us a lot of difficulty in combating the bad guys. So the first is the amount of data that we're dealing with, right? So to really understand where the risk is as it relates to access and identity, you've got to understand what identities you have, what kind of access rights, permissions, entitlements are granted and set up and assigned, the policies that you care about, whether they're your own internal business policies or regulation and mandates that your business needs to follow, the activities of your workers, your workforce, whether they're internal or external, and then the resources that you care about. So if you scope this down to just file shares and did some quick math, 1,000 users or 10,000 users in your company, 1,000 file shares that you care about, and you just do it, do the math in order of tens, you get up to billions and trillions of relationships between the people, through all the access rights and permissioning, through all of the inheritance that might be set up in your access control model to understand what kind of access somebody has assigned. And that's just potential access, right? That's not what people are doing. That's not necessarily actual risk or an actual vulnerability that's occurred in your organization. If you start to throw in activity information and add that into the picture, now you start to get into even more and more data. And that data is coming at you very fast, and there's a lot of it, right? Think about how much file share activity is going on in your environment, or unstructured data activity more broadly, right? So that's the first chasm that we have with sort of the identity and access management products that we have today. And when we talk about that, we're talking about provisioning, which is prevention. Let's get the access for my workers set up right at the beginning. So when the new hire comes on board, let's get them least privileged access that allows them to do their job. That's great, and we need to do that. Somewhere down the road, we do some access reviews. Maybe if you're subject to PCI, you have to do quarterly audits of access. So that's the governance side. That happens on, on some quarterly, monthly, whatever basis. But those are the prevent and detect controls on each side, and there's all that complexity sitting in the middle that we have to try to understand. So that's one piece. When we talk about intelligence that we need here, is we need to be able to understand all these complex relationships that are sitting in our environment. The second chasm we have, we sort of describe with the Hooda Cycle, and this is came out of the military during the Vietnam War. There's a lot of military references in this slide deck. But what was happening with Hooda was part of a psychology experiment with pilots. So during the Korean War, the Air Force was pretty successful in air combat, but they started to have some challenges during the Vietnam War, and so the folks were trying to figure out why, what's going on. We think we had superior equipment, better planes, maybe better pilots, but yet we were losing the air battles. And so what they came up with was this Hooda Cycle: observe, orient, decide, and act, right? So observe would be, I'm flying in a plane, I see my adversary up above me, perhaps with the sun to his back. Maybe that's a strategically strong position for him to be in, to try to attack. So I orient, and maybe I that's all about taking a look at the situation. So I observe him, I orient, and I try to understand what's going on. I decide what I'm going to do, and then I act. And what they learned through the psychology experiments is the decide and act, you had to do that very quickly. And that was the advantage in combat, right? If you were going through an Hooda cycle too slow and your adversary is going through it much more quickly, you quickly became at a disadvantage, right? And you can imagine, so that's my perspective, the other pilot's perspective in that is they're doing the same thing, right? So now this becomes a just churning cycle of observe, orient, and act that each party is doing. So now you translate that to what we're doing in our organizations and what the bad guys are doing, trying to get at us. They're doing these Hooda cycles on the order of days, right? And Jason will talk a little bit more about that, about how quickly some of these breaches happen from the time that the bad guys get in until they understand the situation, and then they start extracting data out, right? So they're working on the order of days here for their Hooda cycles. We, on the other hand, typically, with the solutions that we have today, provisioning and governance like we were talking about earlier, I set up a worker correctly when they start. Perhaps they need some additional access, they make a request, it gets approved, and then somewhere down the road, we take a look at the access that they have as part of our review cycles and attestation process, and we say, all right, what do we need to do? I need to remove access because somebody's over-credentialed, and then we act, right? And our Hooda cycle is probably months if we're good, maybe weeks if we're really good, and never if we're bad. And so now we're dead. We can't win this war or this battle, right? They're iterating their Hooda cycle in days, and we're just moving way too slow. So how do we change this game? That's one of the things that we'll talk about. So, we have all this complexity, and what this session is all about is how do we bring together warehousing and BI types of technologies and capabilities to understand the complexities, to be able to iterate more quickly in response to things that we see, to actually see things more quickly and then act more quickly. And what we do is we bring together our expertise, some of these technologies, and some experience that we see out in the field. ACSE is the Advanced Cybersecurity Center, and that's based out of Massachusetts. And this brings together different companies in the Northeast that are sharing information about hackers, bad guys, so on and so forth. So there's banks in this group, software companies, education, and what they're trying to do essentially, and Jason, you've been to these as well, is they're trying to sort of crowdsource intelligence about what the bad guys are doing. So if you go to one of these meetings, you hear things like the FBI or law enforcement might say, hey, here's a list of IP addresses that you might care about. And they may not give you much more than that, or you may get a lot of detail. Hey, there's a phone phishing scam going on. This is what the call script looks like. These are the phone numbers that you might see with caller ID. Oh, but by the way, don't rely on that too much because they're all spoofing caller ID anyway, and they're making the call look like it's coming from an internal phone. So these are the kinds of things that you start to get a little more insight as to what the bad guys are doing out there. So when you bring together new kinds of technologies, new kinds of analytics, you can start to visualize things in new ways and see things maybe that you couldn't see before, right? So you're able to get sort of a high-level informational view of what's going on in your environment. Things in the upper right are bad, things in the lower left are good. You see something I don't like, you can start to drill down and see some indicators. Now, why is that item up there in the upper left? What are the major contributors to its positioning? You can see perhaps 2 or 3 different indicators. You might be able to go in and slice and dice and start to rotate the data in different ways to see if you can see something or learn something new that you can't see today. And fundamentally then, with this kind of technology, this is all operating on those trillions, billions of relationships that have been created and understood, right? So if you're able to then take something that's extremely complex and boil that down and show that into something fairly simple like a heat map and then let you navigate up and down between those, you start to get some pretty powerful capabilities and pretty powerful insights. You see things that you don't see today. And what we've seen when we've done some analytics like this for our customers is they can start to see some real concrete value in a matter of hours. In some cases, in an hour, which is hopefully what we'll be able to show with Jason this afternoon. And this just helps us reduce the attack surface. One of our banking customers had 3,000 accounts just never used, right? Created for some valid business reason at some point in time, but today didn't make sense. 600 SOD violations, and probably the worst one up there is 50 accounts that were administrative, and I think this was IT administrative accounts for terminated staff. That's a big, big red flag. And we've seen similar kinds of things, and we'll see some more examples of this later on in the presentation, this session, about healthcare, insurance, retail, the kinds of things that they've been able to uncover by doing some more deeper analytics. And the whole idea here is let's change our Hooda cycle, right? Let's disrupt, let's fix, let's remediate, and reduce our attack surface in these areas. So, today, right, they've got this fairly, I don't know if low is the right word, maybe high Hooda cycle, high frequency Hooda cycle. And our goal with the intelligence pieces is to be able to, A, understand what's going on and see more things that we're not seeing today, and then change our Hooda cycle, make it much smaller. And what we're able to do with some of these technologies is get the Hooda cycle down to days or hours or minutes, right? So if you're able to essentially continuously monitor for the things that you care about, then the Hooda cycle starts getting down on the order of minutes. So the example would be, if I care about those IT privileged accounts, I want to know whenever one gets created, or I want to know whenever that access gets assigned, and I can review it right then and there, and start to reduce my attack surface. And so then we can start to win these battles. Is the takeaway here?
Question?
Yeah.
You just said that US bank. How many identities were actually in that US bank?
In the bank?
In perspective of the you said 3,000.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was how many identities were in the bank in the example that we gave where they found 3,000 unused. Yeah.
Probably 30 or 40,000.
30 or 40,000. So about a 10% rate, roughly. Yeah. And we run this internally, and we find things even in our own infrastructure that we didn't expect to see. So, originally I thought maybe we would do a workshop, but I think the crowd is a little too big, perhaps, for that. But what we would typically do in a workshop, and now this is sort of the process that we go through with our customers to say, okay, if we want to start to apply these kinds of techniques, what's the process we're going to use to figure out where we want to start, right? And so we start by thinking about what's important to my business. What do I really care about as far as what's going to potentially damage my business or hurt my business? And in our company, it's our intellectual property. That's what our legal team is always making sure that as a company, as a corporation, our IT department is protecting. For our other people, think of a manufacturing example. One of our customers, their biggest concern is protection of chemical formulas, right? That's their IP. For Coke, I think it's their water supply, right? Isn't that the example there? So in the workshop, we'll typically go through what people really care about and then try to dig into a little bit more. But here's some examples, right? And so just by show of hands, as we go through some of these, I'm curious how many people are, from their business's perspective, think this is important. So this one is all about proper termination. So are folks looking at this today, or if they're not looking at it, do you care about it? This is big at our company, making sure we get folks turned off correctly. And that's turned off not only in the enterprise apps, but turned off in all the cloud apps that we have as well. Do we know what accounts are privileged, and do we have controls for them? So folks care about privileged accounts, IT privileged, and it's not just IT privileged, the typical root administrator kind of things, but in a healthcare organization, privileged might be a clinician who is able to look at high-profile patient records, right? So in hospitals, one of the concerns is I have a nurse or a doctor who's going in and looking at some celebrity who's a patient, right, or a neighbor. In finance, highly privileged might be somebody who can trade over $1 million, right? So it's not just the IT privilege that I, as a technology person, would typically think about. Do we have what it takes to get that staff productive right away? So onboarding the workforce, or changing access when folks change jobs. Not as important, it looks like, but still a handful of folks. Do we know if people are over-credentialed, right? This is a classic case of if I don't have access that I need, I'm calling IT pretty quickly because I can't do my job. But if I'm over-credentialed, I, A, probably don't know it, and B, even if I did know it, it's highly unlikely that I'm going to call IT and say, hey, I've got too much access, all right? But yet, that's a risk. And we'll see some of that in Jason's session. Are only the right privileged people, do only the right people have rather privileged access? And do we know who has access to customer or patient information, right? So these are a lot of the questions, depending on your business and vertical, that are interesting. The other one here, the other angle here is, what's the most labor-intensive area of our identity and access management infrastructure? So this is all about speed of service, cost savings, and efficiencies to my business, right? Do I care about being able to do my quarterly review cycles of access more quickly than I'm doing them today? Do I have a manual process? Do I get advantage out of automating it? So these are the kinds of questions that we go through in a workshop as we're trying to triangulate and orient on what kinds of analytics and what kind of intelligence is going to give the most value to the customer. And this is just an example of some more. The fourth one here is kind of interesting, which is, do you really understand the nesting of the access control model that exists in your applications? And so that can get complicated pretty quickly. And we've had a couple of customers who have said, yeah, I know exactly who my admins are, and I have 5 of them or 10 of them, but when you blow out the nesting and the inheritance around security groups, they have, tenfold more than they expected to see. And they just didn't have visibility into that without the analytics that's able to explode out or unroll all those relationships. So that's sort of a little bit of the process of the kinds of things that we go through, and I'll pull up a spreadsheet here to show you sort of what that looks like and what the kind of things are that we go through with the customer. So this is interesting. I can't see it over here. So on the left side of the screen, these are the types of analytics that were represented by the questions we asked earlier. So we'll go through with the customer and say, for each one of these analytics that you can gain some visibility into, how important is it to you from a risk perspective? Does it help you understand and manage your actual business risk? And that's column D in the spreadsheet. Does it help you manage your regulatory risk? And those two are very different, right? I can be compliant with PCI and protecting credit card information, but I could still be extremely vulnerable on the intellectual property side of the fence, which is the side that I care about, right, or that the company cares about. So we ask the customer to give us a rating for those two areas. This will be a little bit difficult, but they basically rate it with a 1 to 4 type of rating. Then we look at the efficiency. Does this kind of analytic or this kind of capability help my business run faster, run more lean, or run with fewer people, right? And so they rate that area from 1 to 4. And then there's deployment risk. And this is all about how easy or difficult is it going to be for the company, the customer, to get the data that makes this analytic possible. And so I highlighted one up here in yellow, and this was sort of after hours access to file shares. And so, we're collecting activity information about file shares, and we can show access that looks like it's happening in off hours, great. But the customer said that's not really all that useful, right? Because people work from home, they work remote, so on and so forth. But when we're able to start to layer in data from Kronos, now you can start to see when people are accessing file share information during off hours, during non-shift hours, right? That became interesting. And the other thing that they were able to learn by rolling in the Kronos information was people were taking 2-hour lunches, right? So they saw the normal activity during the day of file shares, big spike for 2 hours around lunchtime, and then pop back up afterwards. So this was an example where they didn't have the data that they wanted. Their deployment risk was a little bit higher because we had to roll in some new stuff, but they got much more value on the efficiency side. So, we walk through this process with the customer. We try to figure out what's important, what's not important, what's easy to do, what's hard to do, and ultimately where you can start to get the most bang for the buck. And if I can find my mouse or use the keyboard. What you end up with at the end of this is, there we go, sort of the bubble chart. And the items in the upper right are the high value from both the risk perspective and the efficiency perspective. And the size of the bubble is the deployment risk. So you're looking for small bubbles in the upper right. And then we basically take this and we roll this into a phase 1, phase 2 plan. And that's sort of the process that we go through, at least initially, to kick off the process of figuring out, where do we want to apply the analytics? What's the intelligence that we want to understand that's going to give us the most bang and the most help in our business? Jason, you can keep me honest on time. So what we've found is that there's really four interesting areas, and that's a little hard to see probably for folks. Four areas of intelligence as it relates to identity and access that are most beneficial for companies that are doing the sort of the phase one. The first is abandoned. It's understanding identities and access that's out there that's just not being used. And there's quite a bit of that we see in our customer base. There's also an analytic around unnecessary or excess. And this has all to do with access control groups that are duplicates of other access control groups, access control groups that have 0 members in them or maybe 1 or 2 members in them. And typically this comes about when applications get decommissioned, groups come around, you're a little bit afraid to delete them, and so they just linger. And if those groups have elevated or prived access, that becomes a risk for you. There's an orphan and abandoned, an orphan analytic here, and these are accounts that are essentially unowned. So part of what the analytics do is they go through and classify both accounts and access as privileged or contractor or training related. And then based on the heuristics of how you classify things, you can start to raise or lower the risk rating of people and the resources and the access that they have. But this is typically where we see the most bang for the buck for customers who are trying to get deeper insight into what's going on in their environment. And similarly, they can then run these 4 analytics all the time. And they can configure policies and notifications when thresholds are exceeded or when something new appears as an orphan, and start to take action on that, review it, and act on it very quickly. And that's again essentially reducing that Hooda cycle. So when you go in with this, these are the kind of results and information that you can get out and basically present up to the upper management. This is what we saw from the infrastructure. How big is it? How complex is it? What did we find around privileged access as defined by you, the customer, understanding what's privileged from either an IT or a business perspective. Something that may be privileged from an IT perspective is okay because it's owned by an application. What's ungoverned, what's not even needed, right? And so here's some of the results that we've seen. And Jason, I'll ask you to chime in with the color commentary because you've had much more experience here. This was retailer with the categorization that they were able to do in their environment. They got about 97% coverage. So they were able to classify accounts as employee-owned, application-owned, administrative, test, training, things like that. And what they found that they had to remediate were about 75% of their security groups being unused. And the definition of unused
Are either groups that have nobody in them or single users. This was higher than a lot of places we see. They actually had somebody who was supposed to, they had a contractor who was supposed to be managing the groups for them, and they.
Would you stand closer to the speaker?
Yes, sorry. So they had a contractor who was managing the groups in their Active Directory environment for them, and they created just all this complexity and to make it look like they were doing more than they were, I believe. So we found about 14,000 groups that were just completely empty out of about 18,000, I think.
And it's also fairly common to find complete overlap, where you have a couple of different security groups with exactly the same members that seem to be controlling exactly the same resources. And then they found the normal handful of improper termination, unused accounts. Basically a lot of attack surface sitting out there that didn't need to be there, right? So this is all areas that you can clean up, and these are all things that you can then monitor for all the time. Insurance company, these guys actually were having audits go very smoothly, right? No findings, no surprises, efficient, right? Easy for them to do. And again, this was I think the challenge here was that they weren't seeing the nesting complexity. There was just the complexity of the access control model, so they ended up having more privileged users than they thought they had. And this is an example of duplicate security groups as well, right? Is there any more color on this guy?
A lot of the findings that we had in that specific for that specific customer, they said if audit found this before I did, they'd kill me, and they were thrilled to be able to clean some of that stuff up ahead of time.
Yeah, that's actually kind of an interesting comment. A lot of what we hear from folks is they do not want this kind of tool in the hands of the auditors, right? This is a tool they believe best served in their hands, right? So what they want to be able to do is run this kind of thing and get out in front of the auditors, see what they can find before the auditors come knocking, whether it's an internal or an external audit. So if we had one person tell us, you know, don't tell my auditors about this, right? But they do see huge value in this. This is financial, again, similar sorts of findings. In this example, 30% of the groups essentially unused.
That's more typical of what we find when we run these. 75% was extremely high. Mid-20s to 30% is about average.
Yeah. What would you say you typically see around orphans, percentage-wise?
Probably 20.
That high?
Yeah.
Yeah.
15, 20.
Yeah. And so, you know, these are areas where, for whatever reason, businesses just aren't seeing it. That's getting back to that complexity chasm that we talked about, right? They're just not seeing these kinds of things. We've had folks tell us, I know exactly who my administrators are. I've got 10 of them. And you go in and you do some deeper analytics. You get all the data crunched into a warehouse, and you see things that you just could not see before. Or maybe you could see if you had enough interns, but, you know, no intern wants to sit there and hammer through this data for, 8 hours a day. So we started off talking about identity and access management, sort of the traditional definition of identity and access management being necessary but not sufficient to combat the threats and the risks that we're seeing out there from the bad guys today. And there's two main contributors we were talking through were the challenge of traditional IAM being somewhat discrete. It operates up front to get you the access that you need. It probably gets invoked whenever you have something, when you need something that you don't have today, to go through that request and approval process to get the access granted to you. And if you're lucky, you're going through a monthly or quarterly review of access, but more than likely, you're not going through a full review of access. You're probably reviewing access for the most critical business apps or the business apps that are regulated. So that's the first piece. The chasm is you have to be able to digest, or ingest, I should say, and then digest and analyze all that complexity around identity and access. And then to be able to do that more quickly than we're doing it today. To change the frequency of that Hooda cycle. Getting to the point where we're monitoring continuously, all the time. We're looking for the things that we care about in our business and not having that gap between the time that we grant access at the beginning, check it quarterly, make a change a year down the road, and then turn that access off, hopefully, when somebody leaves the organization. So those are the sort of the big things that we see around what needs to be done around intelligence and access. Close those two areas of the chasm. You saw a little bit about what we do as far as process of working through all the possible things that could be done to help focus in on the things that provide the most value and the most bang for the buck for the customers. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. If you have any questions about our experiences, things you heard here that sounded interesting or maybe you disagree with. Are you asking, so if I understand the question, you're asking if we see differences in verticals, different vertical? Right. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, so the question was, what's the difference that we see in verticals? Are there some areas and some businesses that are stronger with identity and access management? I'd say that at a really high level, we do see some industries that are, well, let me back up a second. There's usually a couple of trade-offs that you have to make when you're doing security and risk and identity and access management. So one of them is, how fast do I want my business to run? And the other dimension or the other access to that is security. So I can turn on security, have a lot of controls, a lot of oversight, but that potentially is going to slow down my business. It's going to be harder for my employees to do their job. The flip side of that is I can relax all of my controls and I can make it very easy for my employees to do things, but I'm carrying a lot of risk. And I would say, and I'll ask Jason to chime in here as well, in general, what we see is that verticals like insurance, the financial industry essentially, insurance, banks, those types of things, they lean towards being stronger on security at the expense of slowing down the business a little bit. If you look at the healthcare industry, they are the complete opposite. They will, when they have a patient that needs care, they will throw security to the wind almost 100% of the time. So they're optimized more for service and efficiency and speed and really patient care, and they will trade off security to get that. The financial industry is, I would say, typically the other way around. And certainly you see the regulations play a factor as well. Manufacturing, if you're dealing with the government, you're subject to ITAR, you're going to have the security side of that equation turned up higher. And Jason, what's your experience been?
We have seen in a lot of highly regulated industries that they are a little bit tighter in a lot of these areas, but we still do see issues in those sorts of places as well, though. Maybe not quite to the same extent, but they're there.
Yeah. Yep. Do we have I guess we don't have microphones to carry around, so just shout it out.
What's remediation look like for a customer after you give them a report that says they have 20% of their accounts stagnant out there? What happens then?
Right. So the question was, when you identify 20% of your identities as being orphaned or 25% of whatever it is needing remediation, what happens?
So we can trigger remediation on some of these things through the tool. A lot of the times, it kind of points out a bigger policy issue, though. Something that you'd want to put in a process to do automated terminations on contractor accounts if they haven't logged in a long time, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that from a remediation perspective, taking orphans as a specific example, there's going to be some obvious ones. There's going to be, these individuals have left the company, their accounts are still active, that's a no-brainer, turn them off. Then, as Jason said, you loop back and you look at the process that HR or your whatever department your manager perhaps is using to figure out, why was that missed? And sometimes there's legitimate reasons. That person came back as a contractor, or we reactivated Exchange email because we wanted their email to transfer to the manager. There's a lot of reasons why that account might be open, but at some point it should be closed out. The other angle to that, where a different type of remediation could be that we just classified the account wrong, right? So it looked like it was an orphan to me, but upon closer inspection, that account actually is an administrative account that just needs to have an owner assigned, and so we have to go find the owner, right? So there's different kinds of remediation that can take place. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a services engagement that happens afterwards most often, where you're an indicator, but then the customer has to have a human go through and actually figure out what didn't happen.
Right. Yeah. So the question was, I was like really close to the mic. So is there a services engagement that goes along with this? Yeah, it can. Depends how the customer wants to remediate. So the process that we just went through here today, and Jason will talk about this, we typically go through with the customer in a day, and we call that a quick scan, which is just let me do a very quick analysis of what we see in your environment. It's not deep, but it highlights some important things, and then the customer can decide, what do they want to do with that. And it may involve, a process change to do a better job with terminations, or it may be something that's even more difficult is trying to get people to stop sharing accounts. In healthcare, yes, about healthcare, that's popular. Clinicians share credentials all the time, and that's not always ideal, because when you say, well, who looked at the record of, some celebrity, and they say, well, Joe, but there's 4 people using Joe's credentials, you have no idea which person actually did that. Remediation can take a variety of forms. Some may be very quick. I know I need to turn off this account. Others may be a much longer process, saying we need to go back and change something in our business process, buy software, configure software. There's a whole range of things that could be done. Yeah.
Talk about intelligence and analysis. It looks like within the four walls, is there a separation between business intelligence and analysis outside of the firewall or outside of the wall?
Sure. Yeah.
How critical are these to differentiate between the two?
Right. So the question was, in the analytics that are being done, is it important, or does it matter if the analytics are done with information that's inside the enterprise or information that comes from the outside world? And so I think the question was about, let me get back to the slide here. Geez, it'd be easier for slideshow mode. So it doesn't matter. It turns out it doesn't matter. If you're with the analytics, what we found is the more data that you can ingest and relate, the more rich information you're going to be able to extract from the system. So, cloud applications, they all have information about identities, the access control model that they have, the activity that people are taking with those applications, the assets that they're protecting, so on and so forth. So whether the application is an on-premise application, a custom application, or a cloud application really doesn't matter. You can ingest the information, do analytics, and find an orphan in some cloud application.
And how does that relate to the penny box example that you showed, where the intelligence you collected is showing them what the adversary from the outside attacking in? How does that relate to it?
Right, so the question was, how does that relate to the adversary from the outside attacking in? I mean, the adversary, whether, they're attacking your resources, right? And that might be a resource that's sitting behind the firewall in the enterprise. But, we use Salesforce.com, and, if a bad guy wanted to get our customer information, that would be an interesting place to attack. Now, Salesforce has their own set of controls and techniques that they're using to make sure that our data is protected. But if our internal processes are not strong, we leave an account open in Salesforce for a person who's left the company, we're still vulnerable. Even though Salesforce has all kinds of controls and protection to help us out, part of it also is our responsibility and falls on our shoulders.
Is those data ingested are both data ingested and combined that way from your services or what you're offering?
So I think the question was, would we combine that data? Yeah. I mean, so when you ingest data, you can ingest data from Active Directory, from Salesforce, from ADP, from your internal RACF system, right? And then you can run that classification rule across all those identities. Are they employees, contractors, partners, whatever? And if you can also ingest HR data, then you can start to correlate, and we can understand that, there's a worker who left the organization, but their ADP account is still open. That's a risk that we don't want to carry. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So when you perform the analysis, is a one-time shot, and then you deploy it into onboarding and create workflows around how you want to mitigate the risk?
So the question was, when you do the analysis, is it a one-time thing, or is it a continual process, right? So it's a continual process. The one offering that we have is just to come in for a day, do it one time, show you the results, and then let you decide what you want to do. That we just call a quick scan. So it's fast, has low impact to the organization. You do it in about a day or hours. But for our customers who buy solutions like this, they let it run all the time, and they may be ingesting data hourly, daily, depending on on what they want to do. We actually have a couple of different paths for the analytics phase. There's a path for what we call slow-moving dimensions, and these are things that do not change very frequently, so those analytics run on a less frequent basis. And for the quickly changing dimensions, that would be largely activity. You know, there's a lot of things happening all the time, and when something happens, you want to see it fast, in a timely manner. Those analytics run on the order of minutes.
Is anything that's close to real time?
The question was, is there anything that goes to real time? Not quite real time. We would say near real time. Real time has certain implications and certain meanings where folks expect things to happen, you know, in milliseconds. In our solution, there's a sort of slow path, fast path for the analytics. Yeah. Other questions, thoughts? Well, we'll be around. I'm so far back in the slide deck, I can't show you the other session. So Jason will be doing a deep dive on a couple of breaches in the next session, and then we'll do sort of one of these live analytics in the third session for the day. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate the time.